When I was 12, I attended summer camp to learn how to ride horses. We were going to be away from my parents for 4 or 5 nights. I was really excited because I always wanted to learn how to ride a horse due to my love for animals. But I was also nervous about being away from my family and around strangers for that long. Most of it was amazing and everything I dreamed of. However, the one night labeled Sleep Under the Stars is an experience that I don't think I'll ever forget. That night we had to leave our bunks and go outside to sleep in tents. I hated tents when everyone else was doing it. So I figured I'd play along. There were a lot of activities that took place before bed. We were able to sit by the campfire, make s'mores, and tell stories. When it came time for bed, it was 4 of us to attend. And I could already tell I wasn't going to get much sleep. I just couldn't get comfortable and was wishing it was morning. The other people in my tent seemed to pass out almost immediately, which led me to sit there and try to count sheep in the dark. There were a lot of tents in a small area due to the fact that everyone in the camp was sleeping outside for one night. I was starting to get a little drowsy when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside of the tent. I was right near the mesh window of the tent because I tended to get hot and was hoping the cool breeze would let me sleep. The footsteps then got louder, but I tried to ignore them, presuming it was a counselor or one of the camp leaders. But then I felt a presence right outside my tent. It was like someone was kneeling right outside the mesh window. I gathered the courage to look outside the window, and there was something outside. I didn't look long enough to see what it was, but something was there. It was silent at first. But then I heard whispering, mumbling and whispering for minutes and minutes without a break. I couldn't really make out the words because it was so soft. But I could definitely hear something. I thought I could hear the words, Savior. Sacrifice wept. I feel like I've heard the word swept a lot. But like I said, I couldn't really make it out. Every so often, that would stop and I would peek my head out of my sleeping bag to check and see if someone was there. And the figure was always still there right outside the mesh window. On and off. I could hear the whispering and mumbling all night. I tried several times to kick or punch someone in my tent to wake them up. But it didn't work. Eventually, during one of the moments of silence, I must have dozed off as scared as I was. I have no clue how I was able to fall asleep even ever so briefly. I checked the window again and nothing was there. But about 5 minutes later, I heard a loud shriek and a gust of wind. When I woke up the next morning, I asked everyone if they heard or experienced anything similar to what I did during the night. No one heard or saw anything other than me. I know I wasn't asleep, and then I absolutely saw and heard those things that night. I don't want to say it wasn't human because nothing gave me that idea. But what type of person would have knelt by our tent and mumbled under their breath the entire night? As scared as I was at the time, I'm glad I never had another experience like that again. If you're like me, staying home alone every day in the summer can become a drag. I've always been someone who needs to stay busy all the time. I don't like being alone and like to always be active. Last year, after finishing my freshman year of college, I decided to take a summer job to make some extra cash. I worked for a landscaping company, but the pay was under the table. I won't put the name of the company out there, but the owner seemed eager to get me on immediately, so I figured perhaps I could become a full-time employee later in the summer. For the time being, he agreed to pay me based on different jobs we did. For the first few weeks, it was great. I was getting super tan and jacked from other lifting. The first 3 weeks he paid me in, I was getting paid quite well. But by the time we got to the 4th week is when things started to get weird. He usually paid me on Friday, but didn't pay me this week. When I brought it up to him, he just smiled and said that he was going to start paying me every 2 weeks. I was kind of annoyed, but basically said whatever because I figured I would have a fat paycheck in another week. Well, fast forward another week and I don't get paid. Now I'm upset. I've been doing hard work for 2 weeks and not getting paid. I called my boss and asked what the deal was. He claimed he just forgot and was sorry. I shrugged it off and said, whatever, it was fine. We agreed to meet on Saturday for the payment. I went to the spot, he told me to meet him at, and he handed me an envelope. I took it and told him I'd see him on Monday. When I opened the envelope, it was just pay for 1 week. I called him furious, but he insisted that he paid me for the previous week. I flipped out over it and told him I didn't want to continue working, especially under the table, and that it was making me uncomfortable. He called and begged me to come back for a huge job we had next week, and that he would pay me double. I agreed, thinking this would likely be my last job and I could take the cash and move on. Monday comes in, I meet him at this huge house surrounded by nothing but open land. We started laying mulch and setting up the front yard. Before I knew it, I was alone. I didn't see him anywhere. I got a little angry that I was now by myself doing all this work. After an hour or so, I finally see him emerge from the back of the house. He looked frustrated and almost a little nervous. He came up to me and in a very soft voice, he said, "Can you go see if you can get the water turned on in the basement?" I tried and I couldn't get it, please. It was a weird request. I honestly wanted to get out of the heat for a second. So I accept it. Once in the basement, I found the water hooked up in a matter of seconds. But what I noticed right away was that the water was already on. I turned around quickly. And that's when I saw my boss and the skinny woman standing behind me. He had his hands out facing me. And she had one hand behind her back almost as if though she was concealing something. Before I could speak, he said he shouldn't have come down here. And just so you know, I'm sorry. Thinking quick on my feet, I kicked him in his ankle and ran right through the skinny woman. I got to my car and drove away and called the police. The worst part about all of this was that there was literally nothing they could do because I was technically working under the table. And there was no records of this man's company even though I had seen one of his trucks with a logo on it. Fortunately for me, this guy didn't know where I lived. It almost seemed like the company was a scam from the start, but I'm not sure what his intentions with me ever were. I know there is a lot I could have done differently. But this is easily the weirdest experience of my entire life. Was this cycle really going to try to hurt me over a week or so of pay? Either way, I'm glad I never ran into that landscaping psychopath again. 2 years ago, my wife and I purchased a small property on the lake for the family to spend the summer months away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As soon as kindergarten concluded for the year, my wife and I packed up our belongings and our 5-year-old son to set off for our new summer vacation home. My wife is a biologist and she would be able to work from home due to our location and research she could do from our property. Our family is fortunate that she has such a successful job, which allows us the freedom to live comfortably. Unfortunately for me, we have moved a lot over the last 10 to 15 years and have not been able to stay with the same company for an extended period of time. This new town had one small grocery store that seemed to be the main location that everyone used for shopping. It also seemed to be a hotspot for tourists who would visit once the weather turned warm. Luckily for me, I am a trained butcher from jobs I had in my early 20s. So finding work was usually not very difficult. I applied for a job at this small store and got a job almost immediately. There will be 2 butchers on staff, myself and the guy who ran the store will the same person who hired me. For the first few weeks, he seemed like a pretty quiet and laid-back guy. I would get to work every day shortly after 7 a.m. He never really cared that I was usually 5 minutes late. He was about 6 foot tall, greasy black hair, and a huge nose. He had really small green beady eyes. His voice was really low and rumbled a bit when he talked, and he had baby-looking teeth like when he smiled. You could see a whole mess of teeth. After the first few weeks is when I noticed things starting to get a little odd. His temper would get out of hand and he would explode on me, seemingly out of nowhere. And then 5 minutes later be totally cool again. It didn't really bother me too much, because he was technically my boss. And I just assumed maybe he had some kind of anger issues. And I'm not one to judge. After these first few weeks of little outbursts, they began to get more uncomfortable. He would start saying things like, "He better get this done before I leave, or you'll be sorry." Or mumble things like, "Sometimes I think he'd be more help if you were dead." This stuff made me uncomfortable. But again, I just assumed that maybe that's how he managed. I met a lot of old school butchers during my time in this business, and some of them are really intense individuals. So I figured this was more of one and the same. Fast forward to a day when I showed up to work 15 minutes late. I got caught in a traffic jam. And unfortunately, there isn't really any alternative routes to get to the store. I showed up and Will was just standing in the meat cooler staring at me. He had a black apron on covered in blood from cutting all morning, with the huge butcher knife still in his hand. I tried to apologize. And before I could speak, he put his hand up to silence me and said in his deep voice, "This will be the last time you're late, the last person to disrespect me." And he kind of paused for a moment and looked down to the ground and then finished by saying, "Never mind, just don't be late again." The next few days, he was very quiet, like something was bothering him. But to me, it was great not having to hear him complain about everything. He left early one day and told me to just make sure I cut a few extra things and to clean the meat. It was about 7 p.m. and now was about to call it a night and head home. And so I noticed something. In the back corner of the meat cooler, we had what was called bone scans. This is a waste can where you dispose of bones and trim fat. Coming out of the bottom of one of the cans was a small pool of blood. Now ordinarily, this wouldn't be a huge deal, because I see this a lot with my job. But this pool looked fresh and the smell was real bad. I tried to move the can, and it was much heavier than it usually was. They get picked up once a week. But this week, they were a day late for some reason. I took the lid off and almost passed out due to the smell. I also noticed meat in there that was a strange color. And again, a lot more blood than usual. I put the lid back and left that night, trying to figure out what the heck was in that can and why it smelled so bad. Had been in this business for a long time and I've smelled bad meat before, but this was so bad. The next day I came in and Will was standing in the corner again and looked incredibly angry. He came at me with a crazed look in his eye and a knife in hand and said, "What do you think you saw on that?" He started to poke my chest with his finger and say in a really hostile and defensive voice, "Come on, pal. Tell me what you saw. I know you were digging, just tell me what you think you saw." His voice started to turn into a yell. And the sooner I decided to call it quits. "Once you put your hands on me, I am done." The crazy thing is, I don't even know how he knew I looked in the bone can. Maybe I left the lid ajar, I couldn't remember. I left, and he actually followed me to my car. Not to apologize but to keep on hammering me about the bone can. I drove off and looked in the mirror and he was standing in the parking lot still yelling to himself. Now the reality is I didn't actually dig or even look in the can longer than a few seconds. I drove home immediately, and my wife of course supported me and was happy to let me just spend the rest of my summer breaks with my son being a stay-at-home dad. About a week after the incident where I quit, I was awoken in my recliner in my living room close to 4 to 5 a.m. I was woken up by lights outside the head driven by the property. The wife was already gone for the day, and my son was sleeping. All the lights in the house were off, and I made my way to the window. There was a massive red pickup truck parked outside my house. Now the scary part is there was nobody inside the truck. And even though I couldn't make out a lot of the details, the truck looked like the one always parked outside of the grocery store. Will's truck. I went into my son's room and stayed there awake for the rest of the night. At about 7:30 a.m. I looked outside and the truck was gone. For the next few nights, I saw that truck driving around the block, but couldn't see the driver. I told my wife what I had been seeing, and she recommended perhaps we go back to the house in the city as her current project was almost done anyway. A few weeks after being back in the city, I needed to head back out to the lake to grab some of the items that we had forgotten. When I got there, one of our windows was broken and things were tossed around like someone had been inside the property. I did report this to the local authorities, mostly to document the damage that had been done to the property. I know I don't have any proof that will cause the damage, or that my family was actually in danger. I just know something was off about that guy. And I think next year we are planning to sell that property and find some much further away from that area. The events of the story happened a couple of years ago to my friends and I after our last day of high school in our senior year. We decided to celebrate by hiking and camping in this massive forest close to our hometown. We talked about it for years, and this is going to be our celebration for graduating. Our friend group was pretty outdoorsy, but so were most of the people who grew up here. Anyways, we had always heard that there was a beautiful crystal clear lake in the middle of the forest. The lake was supposedly accompanied by breathtaking waterfalls. One of our friends, Chris, got hiking directions to the lake, and we decided to make this post-graduation trip a reality. Chris had the most outdoor experience out of all of us, so we trusted him to make the plans. He was Chris and his girlfriend Mindy, myself, and my friend Danny, and our other friend Tony, with his girlfriend Marissa. The trip was planned as a 3-day hiking trip while camping each night under the stars. It sounded amazing. We would reach the lake on the second day and then head back. We would have to camp one more night and be back on the third day pretty early in the morning. The trip started out amazing. I have never really been the biggest fan of sleeping in a tent, but the views were truly breathtaking. The sounds and the way the sun shined through the trees made it seem like we were exploring another world. Once it started to get dark, we decided to set up camp for the night. It was pretty comical watching us trying to set up tents while exhausted, but we managed to figure it out. We stayed up for a while telling stories and playing pitch, but caught it a night relatively early so we could start back up hiking at sunrise. Danny and I woke up in our tent shortly after 3 a.m. We saw we could hear voices outside of the tent. It sounded like air, but didn't have the howling of the wind. He told me of course it was wind and there was nothing to worry about. But to me, it almost sounded like whispers. I could hear sticks cracking in the distance. You'd expect to hear quiet or even crickets or something. But instead, it was all sorts of other racket. I had a horrible feeling that maybe there was a bear or something out there. Or maybe even other people. And then fear came over me, feeling like we weren't alone. Danny eventually fell back asleep, but I was wired for the rest of the night. I sat clenching my pillow and jumped out at every little noise. A little after 6, I heard Chris outside of his tent and I went out to greet him. He also heard the weird noises and admitted that in all the years camping, he never heard noises like that, but wasn't really alarmed. We packed up our gear and headed out to the lake. If we kept good pace, we would make it by noonish. We all seemed sluggish and tired from the night. We were more tired and short with each other today than the previous day. I had an uneasy feeling the entire day, thinking somebody was out there following us. About 12:30, we arrived at the lake, and honestly it was so worth it. The waterfalls looked like glass, the way the sun reflected off of it. And the water actually looked like it was glowing. It was beautiful. We swam for a while and played by the waterfall. The events of the previous evening seemed to vanish in my mind for a while. We got dry and decided to start heading back, so our third day of hiking tomorrow wouldn't be so bad. We set up camp about 5 hours or so from our cars. If it was up to me, I would have just kept walking. But anybody who has been in the woods at nightfall knows it's pitch black. It wasn't worth getting lost, so we decided to just camp and get home tomorrow. We were all beats and passed out almost right away after setting up camp again. I was jolted awake a little after 3 a.m. This time, there was no mistaking it. There was clearly voices outside the tent. We could hear women's voices, several of them, and they were laughing. Normally laughing like a giggle. A deep, screeching laugh. We could hear the branches on the ground breaking around us. It seemed like we were surrounded. Danny was awake with me, and he was scared stiff. We could only make out several words amongst the mumbles. We'll get here, the creepy voices saying things in their low drawn-out voices, flesh and strike, I want to strike. Those horrifying phrases were followed by more cackling and mumbles that we couldn't make out. We all sat in fear all night listening to these noises on and off. It would stop for a time and then start back up, almost sounding like it was directly outside the tent. At sunrise, we heard Chris yell outside his tent. We all came out to find a crazy amount of footprints surrounding our campsite. And they went in all sorts of directions with seemingly no rhyme or reason. There were strange patterns or rocks and sticks set up all over the campsite. The sticks looked bent and almost human-like silhouettes. We packed up our gear in record time and nearly ran the rest of the way out of the forest. Unlike the previous 2 days, we heard laughing and twigs snapping in the distance the entire trek back to the cars. Myself and Mindy started to cry just because of the sheer panic and fear we felt while trying to race out of the woods. And probably because we were extremely overtired. When we would look in the distance behind us, or side to side, we would see nothing. But we still heard the sounds. We finally made the near 5-hour hike in just under 4 hours. It was an amazing sigh of relief to be able to see the cars. As we all ran to our cars to load the gear up, I sat in the passenger seat and waited for Danny. None of us have ever returned to that forest. I'm not really sure what happened to us over the course of those few summer nights. Some say witchcraft, and others say just some women or kids who were messing with us. Others think it was our imagination. But we all witnessed the same thing. I know what I heard that evening. Maybe it doesn't seem that scary. But for me, it was the most terrifying couple of nights of my life. What a way to start off graduation and my summer vacation. I'm currently in my late 20s. But at the time of these events, my 8th grade school year just ended. I was excited that I was going to be able to spend the entire summer with my 2 closest buddies, and that we would be heading into 9th grade together. We didn't really do much other than just hang out, play PlayStation, to play some basketball outside, and message girls from our class on Instant Messenger. Which I hope most of you remember what that was. If not, then I guess I'm getting way too old. We would usually hang out at my house, because my parents were always pretty cool with my friends being there. And the way my house was set up, we pretty much had a ton of privacy, which was awesome for teenage boys being idiots. My house at the time was located on a pretty quiet street. But my neighborhood was in close proximity to the more rough sections of my hometown. A close walk from my house was a corner store that sold really cheap soda, chips, and candy. This was obviously a frequent destination for me and my friends. Well, about a week after 8th grade ended, my 2 buddies were staying overnight, like they always did. We thought it would be a cool idea to sneak out of the house after my parents went to sleep and walk to the corner store a few blocks away. Of course, not to do anything crazy, but just to have the thrill of being out late on our own. And being a foolish teenager, I had no awareness of the danger I was potentially putting myself and friends in. Around 11, my parents went to sleep. And that's when we decided to sneak out of the house. At first, the thrill of being out was awesome. But the feeling would soon change when we got to the store. We went in there with about $20 and we planned on spending it on a whole bunch of snacks. We all split up to grab certain things. And I was in the back corner looking at the soda when I saw somebody lurking in the opposite corner. The only reason why this was concerning to me was because he was facing me and not facing the shelves of products. I pretended I didn't notice, because who knows, maybe it was just a coincidence. As I looked at the Faygo sodas, I noticed in the reflection of the cooler that a shadowy figure was now moving closer and still facing me. I quickly grabbed a 2-liter and went and found my friends. I darted away. And when I looked back, the figure was standing right where I was just a moment ago, and still facing me and not the case. I was freaked out. But I didn't want to let my friends know that I was. I also want to add that there was nobody else in the store other than us, the cashier, and this guy or girl. We grabbed our stuff and cashed out. I was trying to be quick about it. My friends were being stupid and loud, perhaps trying to show off, but honestly, I was just freaking out. We started the several block walk home, and I was moving pretty good. And finally my friend stopped and asked what my problem was. I told them what had happened in the store and they seemed pretty rattled as well. We continued moving quickly. My house was maybe only 100 feet away at this point when we noticed that the person from the store was now rushing full speed up the hill at us. We ran as fast as we could. Lucky for us, the lunatic was still quite a ways away yet. We ran into the front door and for some reason still tried to be as quiet as we could as not to wake my parents. We turned to unlock the door, made sure all the lights were off. The person reached my house and started to bang on the front door angrily. That's when I finally gave into logic and woke my parents, who immediately called the authorities. I tried yelling through the door that we call the cops, and the person didn't seem to respond. He just kept trying to open the door and continued banging on it. After a minute or two, he took a decorative stone from our front yard and broke the window next to the front door. That is when I finally got a good look at the guy. He tried to climb into the window and the broken glass knocked his hood off. He was completely expressionless. He had dirty blonde hair, was clean shaved, and honestly looked like an average Joe. He was about halfway through the window when my dad came out with a bat and started swinging at him. Before there was too much of a struggle, we saw the lights and heard sirens. The cops got out of the car screaming and pulled the men out of the window. It was the most intense thing I've ever seen in front of my eyes. The man was obviously arrested. Apparently he had no criminal history, and no history of drugs or alcohol. When questioned by the cops, he said, "Honestly, I was bored. And I just felt like being a little bit evil tonight." We had no idea what his intentions were, but just felt incredibly lucky that we somehow came out of that event physically unharmed. Mentally, I still think about that night over a decade later. I used to stay up for hours thinking if we weren't that far ahead of him, he could have caught up to us and possibly hurt us. I also used to stay up for hours and fear that he would show up at my house again when I least expect it. It just goes to show you that even the most harmless decisions can sometimes lead to consequences you regret the most.